Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for this Wiser Study Preparation for Admissions Test Guide. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and over the course of the session, I'm going to be helping to guide you through what exactly top UK universities, specifically Oxford and Cambridge universities, look for in the admissions test. As a little bit of background about myself, I studied at Cambridge University with a degree in classics, and since then I've been working in the education sector for the past 7 years, collaborating closely with Wiser Study, and in that time I've personally had the experience of supporting over 4,000 students with their Oxbridge applications. With the tutors I've worked with, we've had a success rate of 43% compared to about an 18% national average. So hopefully that goes to show that we do have a lot of experience in this area, and I'm going to be delighted to share some of that with you today to give you a closer semblance of exactly what these admissions tests aim to design and cover and what is looked for. The webinar is going to be structured in 5 main sessions. The first one is talking about how much weight these admissions tests actually carry in the overall applications procedure. We'll then move on to look at the different types of admissions tests that might be required for the different subjects at Oxford, Cambridge respectively, what the admissions tutors are looking for in those specific tests, before moving on at the end to discuss the 2 final areas, which is how students can best prepare and start now to achieve a high score in the test, followed by some high impact tips and tricks from our experience in the sector to show you some different approaches to the question styles that are asked and ways that you can help to advantage yourself within that system, especially with regards to aspects like timekeeping and also multiple choice question strategies. Without any further ado, I'll jump straight into the first section, which is how much weight these admissions tests carry. Now, admissions tests are required for almost every single subject at Oxford and Cambridge. A few notable exceptions, but almost every single subject requires them, and they are taken right after the end of the UCAS deadline. So the UCAS deadline being the 16th of October, the majority of tests are taken around the 18th and 19th of October. There are a couple of exceptions to that. The main 2 exceptions are law for the LNAT, where you actually have to take the test prior to the 16th of October deadline. And the second exception to that is with the UCAT, where you'll also likely take the test in September time for medicine applicants. The most important thing I can emphasize today is these tests are substantially more difficult than A-levels. The goal of these tests is to differentiate candidates who are already getting top A-level grades and who have strong personal statements from each other in a competitive application field. Some subjects at Oxford and Cambridge, I give you the example of economics and management, overall has about a 5% success rate, and less than 35% of students get invited to the interview stage at the university. So the admissions test is one of the largest factors in the build up to that allows the admissions tutors to determine and separate candidates with good A-level grades. For that reason, it's really important to prioritize these admissions tests and start preparations early. The other thing I want to emphasize is if candidates do take this admissions test and do well, it's not just about passing the admissions test and making it onto the interview stage. This represents an overall weighting in the whole application of around 30%, alongside around 40% for the interview, 15% for A-level grades, and 15% for the personal statement. So the admissions test alone is worth as much as your A-level grades and your personal statement combined in the overall weighting of the application. And that's the reason why it's really important to prepare well and try and stand out from the crowd in this admissions test, because it will factor into the final decision on whether you're awarded a place at Oxford or Cambridge. To help emphasize that and back this point up with data, I've given you an example from the NSAA, which is the Engineering Admissions Assessment taken by applicants to Cambridge University. This data comes from a Freedom of Information request that we submitted to Cambridge University and helps to break down the scoring that different applicants got on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being low and 9 being high, versus the offer holders who then went on to achieve a place. Now, This is the raw data, but if I present and map that in two graphs for you, what you can see is that a lot of candidates, unfortunately, do perform poorly in that admissions test. And if you look at that offer holders rate to applicants rate, a strong score in the admissions test, particularly on section 2 in this case, which is the harder level of sections for NSAA, directly correlates with who was offered places. This goes to the NSAA, and actually in Oxford, the tests are even more directly mapped because less candidates tend to be invited to interview, and for that, the admissions test is thus even stronger than this Cambridge graph for engineering. And hopefully that just goes to show and emphasize that value that is placed on the admissions test by both universities. So now we've seen that these admissions tests are really important to prepare for. Let's break down some of the different types. And this page in particular, I am sorry for the medley of different acronyms that come to you, but this covers the majority of key subjects with a couple of exceptions. If you're studying classics or if you're applying for a subject like Asian and Middle Eastern studies, there are also admissions tests, but I've tried to break down the main ones that appear here and some of the different requirements, the different tests that are needed to be taken for them. There are a couple of things that you should bear in mind. Now, some candidates perform better at interviews live, and some candidates will perform better in a written test. If that is the case and you're applying for a subject like biology or chemistry, at Oxford there are no admissions tests, whereas at Cambridge you take the NSAA, which has both a mathematical and science section to it. So candidates who perform particularly well at interview can actually have an advantage of going for the Oxford system, versus candidates who perform well in a written test can have an advantage for the Cambridge system there. Exactly the inverse applies to a subject like geography, whereas Oxford has introduced a new admissions test this year called the GAT, whereas Cambridge has no admissions test for its geography applicants. So it is worth bearing in mind for individual students, whether they're someone who tests well and performs particularly high in tests, who might be a little more nervous speaking and outlining their thoughts out loud, compared to those students who are eloquent at announcing their thoughts, but might not stand out when it comes down to showing all of their workings in detail on paper. The majority of tests are also different for Oxford compared to Cambridge. So it's really important that students decide on that university choice and also are preparing for the right test to maximize the level of preparations. And even in some cases, a test can have a very different format at Oxford compared to at Cambridge. In some cases, for example, if we take looking at physics here, the PAT involves both short answer questions and multiple choice questions, more so than the completely multiple choice sections at the start of the NSAA. So in cases like that, it is important as well to make sure you're preparing for the type of test that's coming up. There are some tests, though, that are standardized, in particular the BMAT and the LNAT. The last thing I want to mention on this side is that Cambridge Admissions Assessments, who run these tests, have announced that in 2025, there will be a major change undergoing the sector, and these tests will no longer be run in their current forms. Now, these tests will absolutely be run this year, and we are expecting a very similar form of test to ultimately replace the ones currently run in their current form here, but it is worth noting that this is about to change for 2025 applicant entry, and that more details are being released on that new format of tests soon. One other exception I'd particularly like to mention here is when we come to look at economics versus computer science. Now, you can see here that actually economists and computer scientists at Cambridge take exactly the same test, the TMUA, which is a fully mathematical test with a published syllabus online. In comparison, at Oxford, there's the TSA, which involves elements of both verbal reasoning and also a variety of different answer questions that require you to make logical deductions and inferences from a passage. So it's really important to note here that individual tests can have a very different format, from a more humanities focus on something like TSA, Economics and Management course at Oxford, to something that's purely mathematical for the Economics TMUA test in preparation for Cambridge University. On that front, the clear and overwhelming feature that I want to emphasize here is not all of these tests are the same. And so please do ask either us, and you'll see a contact email for that at the end of this presentation, or to check the requirements very, very carefully on the website to make sure you're preparing for the right test. Even further than that, I've given an example here of the TSA. Now, the TSA is composed of 2 sections. Section 1 is entirely multiple choice, and section 2 requires candidates to answer a short essay prompt from a variety of options. And actually, if you apply for economics and management, you only have to answer the multiple choice section, whereas PPE requires both sections to be answered. So even when candidates are taking the same test, they might be answering different sections of that test. And that's why it's really important to check those full details very carefully. The tests also do have a different level of difficulty. In particular, the most notable difference here is the step 2 and step 3 examinations for Cambridge mathematics. These are harder than the MAT that Oxford requires for mathematics applicants. And in that reason, the step 2 and step 3 tests are actually taken in the following year directly before entry for candidates, whereas the MAT is taken in the usual October window that I mentioned. But again, it is important to work out the relative difficulty level of those tests, to work out if a candidate's, again, not particularly testing too well, and they are undecided between Oxford and Cambridge universities. Is there a particular advantage of going for that slightly easier test compared to the more difficult one if they don't have that sufficient level of subject knowledge yet? It's difficult to break down each of the overall tests without going into specifics on one specific type of test, but I've tried to do that here to give you a semblance of exactly what students need to be preparing for by the broad theme of their tests. Now, for STEM and biosciences related tests, almost all of the papers do involve an element of multiple choice questions, and some of those papers are exclusively multiple choice questions. I'll come on to some strategies of how to prepare for multiple choice, but for that reason, for STEM and biosciences applicants, timekeeping and preparation of specific multiple choice strategy is a really important aspect of the test. For STEM and biosciences, there is also usually a syllabus that is released online that students can review and should absolutely be familiar with each individual area of. That becomes particularly important because students are going to see questions that are very different to their A-levels in these tests. So they're going to need to know that syllabus like the back of their hand to know what to apply at what stage for the admissions test, because it will be testing those skills in very different ways to how they're used to at A-level. In comparison, for humanities and arts testing, there is a lot of papers that involve a short essay component, like the ELAT, like the modern languages admissions assessment, and like the English assessments for both Oxford and Cambridge. For that, the key for students is to create a line of argument on these papers. It's really important that students do not sit on the fence. They need to have a strong and definitive line of argument running right the way through the essay to justify their point. Lots of the papers as well, like the history admissions assessment, also involve some kind of source work analysis or selection and prioritization skills based on reading. And again, it's really important that candidates are familiar with reading fast and skim reading, but also being able to work out and deduce the relevant factual information as part of an admissions test, rather than reading the whole thing with equal weighting. There is a lot of information that is provided in these tests that is irrelevant, that candidates need to skip over to deduce and work out exactly what part is relevant to the answering of the question. So what exactly are the admissions tutors looking for in these tests? What really distinguishes that candidate who's getting a level 8, level 9 weighted score versus a candidate getting a level 4 or level 5 weighted score? We've boiled this down to a top 5 list of qualities. The first is a wide knowledge base. It's really important not to be too linear in your study and knowledge of the syllabus and A-levels. Students need to be prepared to engage with all of the fringe areas of that subject. In mathematics, you can't just be a statistician to do well in these tests. You need to have an understanding of stats and pure maths and elements of algebra and calculus right the way through to other elements such as your Bayesian inference style questions. Similarly, if you're talking about humanities-based, students can bring in their own knowledge and are strongly encouraged to do so. So the more you're reading around your subject now and the more evidence you have available to you to deploy, the easier it will be to mobilize that evidence in answer to a question and to successfully create a strong line of argument in your essay structure. The second and most natural reason is students do need to have a passion for their subject as well. That really clearly shines through on paper, and it's important to remember that the professors who will be reading these tests and who will ultimately be the ones hoping to work with these students if they're accepted to Oxford and Cambridge have dedicated 30 or 40 years of their life to the study of the subject. And it's very, very clear the students who are parroting the line of A-levels or the line of their teacher versus the students who are actually grappling and exploring difficult contexts and are enjoying that part of it. Students shouldn't be shy of having a decisive opinion, even if it's not their own opinion, if it creates a strong argument and a way that they can engage and interact with their subject in a more unique way. Similarly, for maths-based questions and the questions that require short answers, showing creativity and showing an impressive way of working something out does carry a lot of credit. Students will also need to have excellent time management skills. I would say that if all candidates were given about 3.5 or 4 hours for all of the different admissions tests, I actually think everyone would do very well because, as we say, the majority of candidates applying for these tests already have those A and A-star grades. So what becomes really important is the ability to manage that time successfully rather than running out of time, as a lot of candidates tend to do. And I'll come on to some strategies for ways that you can manage that time successfully in the last part of this webinar. They will also test independent critical thinking skills, and that's your ability to apply knowledge that you have learned from your A-level course and from the syllabus in ways that will be unfamiliar to you or not so linear as an A-level mark scheme. Students really need to think creatively to do well in these tests and how they might apply a concept that isn't an immediately obvious one to solving a new style of question. Good communication skills are also very important and will be tested and relied upon more at the interview stage. But if you can show that now in terms of a logical argument, clear sentence structure, and succinct points, it will really help to stand candidates out. If you don't believe me as well, that picture on the right is taken from Cambridge University's website on exactly what it looks for in applicants. And hopefully you can see that close correlation to the 5 points I'm talking about there with the best hints that Cambridge officially releases on what they actually look for when selecting applicants. So let's move on to those tips and tricks on how to best prepare and achieve a high score. The first and most important part of general advice I have for admissions tests where there is a syllabus is to use this traffic light system. So going through each and every individual area of the syllabus and marking out points in a green, yellow, or red traffic light system. Now, if you're a course advisor joining this webinar as well, this is something that you can absolutely do with the students to print off that syllabus and encourage them to submit it to you with that green, amber, and red traffic light based system. It really helps to identify areas where the student is green, fully confident and prepared on the material. Amber, an area that the student knows a little bit of, but remains unsure of, or particularly importantly, might continually be dropped down on marking for because they don't have quite that understanding of how to apply the knowledge. And then also red, which might be new areas of knowledge or areas of knowledge that the student doesn't remember or isn't familiar with. It's really important that by the time students are taking this admissions test, all of those sections are in green and the student is ready to go. Now, when they start off with this process, it's better to be harsh. I would much rather something goes in yellow than green if the student's on the fence, because it allows you to prioritize and select time accordingly when it comes to revision. Students really need to know that syllabus first, inside out, before they go on to take the limited number of official past papers that are available, so that by the time they come to those past papers, they can really work on their timekeeping and identifying gaps in their knowledge where they haven't looked and understood the syllabus correctly, rather than jumping in with a past paper and then finding that they don't have many practice questions to work with by the end of the process. Starting early is therefore also very important with this syllabus. And the longer that students take to prepare, the better their chances of overall success. This goes on to develop the point I mentioned about past paper practice. It is absolutely and fundamentally important to do the past papers available, but just like we're making sure we don't start with the past papers, please do also save 2 full past papers in reserve for the immediate 2 weeks building up to the test. That means when students really need to get into that examination mode and have a full practice, they have papers that they haven't seen before to work with, to practice their timekeeping, and also see if they've forgotten any areas from when they start their preparations now in the summer. If students have seen all the questions by the time they come to these past papers, it makes the test day itself naturally more difficult because they're finally encountering unseen questions and haven't had that experience of sensitive timekeeping, which is one of the most difficult components of this test. Secondly, I really strongly encourage students to group questions by question type, rather than just doing every single past paper in order and focusing on those sections that students already know. They should weight their time accordingly to work on those sections in red on that traffic light system and areas where they consistently fall down on the mark scheme. There are only a limited number of question types on each of these papers. For example, by the time students have taken the TSA 3 or 4 times with the past papers, they will notice that there are no surprises in the types of questions that come up. It could be that a student's particularly strong on their logical deduction questions, but particularly weak on their non-verbal reasoning style questions. And if you identify that, there is no point spending an even amount of revision time on both. They really do need to identify the themes of questions where they're stronger and weaker, and then prioritize their revision accordingly. For humanities, there are also a much wider range of essays that are available. And so rather than trying to go through and write 4 or 5 essays in full, I strongly encourage students to write 15 to 20 different short essay plans that take them about 5 or 6 minutes to write. That really gets them in the mode of engaging with the key and central themes of the question and deploying their knowledge, which is far more important than actually writing out the full essay from that point. If they can mobilize that knowledge, if they can attack the question, if they can form that line of argument in their essay plan, they have all the tools they need for success in the real thing. Lastly, students really do need to prepare for these tests with the same intensity and techniques as they would do for a normal school exam. It is really important that students start early and dedicate time to preparing for these tests that, as I said earlier, represent 30% of the overall application. They need to prioritize their time accordingly, because those A-level grades, whilst of course fundamentally still important, are only half the weighted percentage of these admissions tests. Moving on to timings, many candidates fall down on that weighted average between 1 and 9 in that they don't actually finish the test. And so I want to come on to a couple of tips and tricks on how candidates can actually be helped to finish that test in the allotted time available. Now, this is also testing that question selection and prioritization skill that I mentioned admissions tutors are looking for. It's just as important actually as the content knowledge when you come to this timing section. So when students have finished that syllabus and move on to actual past papers, the most important thing they can do is do these tests to time. If all of the students get 5 hours to do the tests, then they will all score very highly, but it won't actually prepare them for the real examination. Now, also, students who have this tendency slightly towards perfectionism, which can often be these top students who aren't quite as used to being challenged by their A-level questions to the same extent, can really actually get pulled down on these admissions tests. And they'll get stuck on a question and be really determined to work it out. But in trying to get 100% on that answer to the question, they do then run out of time and get pulled down on the test overall. almost all of the questions are evenly awarded marks, and especially in multiple choice elements of the test where they all have the same number of marks, students need to work quickly to identify what they know and skip over questions where they're weaker to come back to at the end, so that they prioritize that time picking up the easy marks before they try and grapple with the more difficult ones. So a couple of further strategies to help with this. Please do use process of elimination in working out the right answer. It can sometimes be just as quick, if not easier, to rule out 2 or 3 wrong answers than actually try and find the right one. If a candidate is running out of time at the end of the test, I would much rather that they quickly eliminate 2 or 3 of the options out of 5 to increase their chances of guessing right to 50% for 4 questions, rather than answering one of those questions right and having a complete stab in the dark at 20% accuracy of getting it right for the other 3. So please do use that process of elimination, particularly in STEM-based papers. You can easily rule out some of the options if, for example, there's been a calculation where units haven't been converted correctly or an equation's been applied in the wrong way, and you can work out why that answer is a red herring, rule it out, and then get left between only 2 or 3 potential right answers. Do also please read the question really, really carefully and the options available to you. Some questions might sound very similar, but a question asking you for an implication and a question asking you for assumption are testing very different skills, and it's important to get to grips with that key terminology before you take the tests, especially on the humanities side, so that you know what exactly you're being asked for and how to achieve that. Especially in the essay-based questions as well, qualifiers, such as every, none, never, always, all of these questions do need to be attacked and picked up on. Don't take the question as law. One of the really good ways that you can pick up marks in these tests and score towards that 7, 8, and 9 ratio is to attack that question directly and to point out the assumptions or flaws that it might make. Another technique to save time when it comes to source-based questions or questions based on a passage is to read the options first, then the source. By doing this, you actually only have to read the passage twice. You only have to read all of the information twice rather than 3 times, and it can save you up to 30 seconds each time. To explain what I mean by that, if you read the question, how it usually goes is a candidate reads the question, they read the 5 options, and then they go back to the question to work out which options they can apply and get rid of. Now, by reading those answers first, those potential options, you know what you're looking for in the passage. So when you then go through it for the first time, you can quickly eliminate those options and save having to go back to it. And again, that saves time in the long run. And then do make an itinerary of your mistakes as you go along, from whether that's understanding a particular question word, whether it's timing, whether it's making small slip-ups in a repetitive fashion, or whether it's content knowledge weakness. And then you can really help to plug those gaps. Finally, I want to look at some techniques that will be helpful as part of this process. Now, for the techniques, please do break down your overall goal of that admissions test into a series of much smaller sub-goals as you go through. So quantify when you need to be at the end of each particular section and each particular question, and stick to those timings. Please do also feel, in terms of the technique approach, to work backwards, as we've mentioned slightly with those multiple choice-based questions. If you've got something where you can see that there's a rate of change in the question, you can say, right, I need something to do with differentiation here, and to go through that syllabus knowledge and pick out different types of differentiation to see if one of them gives you an inroad into the question, and then start that question again and see if it helps you work out the answer. That's particularly common in papers where students are trying to apply that skill in a very new way and aren't quite sure what area of the curriculum it relates to. Do work backwards for those questions. If that plan fails and you still can't work out how to approach it, the key goal, as I keep on mentioning here, is do move on. If you can't work out, put a star in the margin and come back to that question at a later stage. In terms of preparations as well, once you have completed that range of past papers, there are the enriched resources published by Cambridge and also a variety of good websites available online that have a huge range of past paper questions that test these same kind of critical thinking skills. So you can still prepare with material outside of past papers if you are finding it challenging to apply that critical thinking knowledge in a different way. There are also elements of overlap between different tests. For example, the LNAT and the TSA both involve elements of logical deduction-based questions. So if you've run out of questions on one particular test, you can absolutely use a similar test and borrow questions from there that test the same format. Similarly, if you're taking the BMAT section 2 that has scientific knowledge, that can be a good introductory foundation to taking the NSAA scientific-based questions. Mark schemes and sample solutions are also available online, and I really encourage students to be introduced and mark their own work on these mark schemes rather than having it marked by a teacher. On that front, it allows you to really actually see what those examiners are looking for, the different techniques and ways to approach a problem, and to also get used to having to view the papers with an examiner's eyes and an examiner's level of detail. So fundamentally, you don't have to be top of your class to do well in these admissions tests. You don't have to be the student getting 3 A stars rather than A star and 2 A's. What you do have to be is well prepared, familiar with that format, familiar with the skills and timekeeping elements required, and to prepare accordingly. Thank you very much, and I am going to open up to questions. Fantastic. So yeah, if there are any questions coming from after this webinar, please do email ask@wiserstudy.com. And in the meantime, I wish everyone the best of luck in preparing for the admissions test, and we look forward to supporting you hopefully in the very near future. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.